Now, who's Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, England. Darwin's father, Dr. Robert Waring Darwin, was a medical doctor, and his grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, was a renowned botanist, and his mother, Susanna, died when he was only 8 years old. At a young age, Darwin was fascinated with the natural world as he practiced collecting objects, fishing, hunting, gardening, and bird watching. These hobbies helps lay the foundation for his later work because it provides an opportunity to become familiar with nature. Outside of his hobbies, he attended a private school at age of 9 years old in Shrewsbury School. Charles was later pulled out of school by his dad to become a doctor at age of 16, and in October 1825, Darwin begins his studies at Edinburgh University in Scotland. And 2 years later, he became a student at Christ's College in Cambridge. And at the age of 22, in year 1831, he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree.
Before we proceed to his theory of evolution, let us tackle first his journey before he came up with that theory. John Stephen Henslow, who is Darwin's professor at Christ College, suggested him for a seat as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. It was a letter from Henslow that brought Darwin the invitation to sail around the world as companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy of HMS Beagle, which is a Navy Royal ship. And Captain Robert Fitzroy's ship was to travel the globe for 5 years as part of a survey mission, and it was originally planned for 2 years, but the voyage stretched it to 5 years. And that trip would turn out to be the young naturalist's once in a lifetime opportunity and help him to be able to take advantage of the opportunity to study the natural world. And as Darwin set out on the HMS Beagle's round the world expedition, on December 27, 1831, he gathered a variety of natural items on the journey, including birds, plants, and fossils. And at that time, Darwin was only 22 years old when he was hired to be the ship naturalist, whereas he spent considerably time ashore collecting plants and animals, and he filled his notebook with sketches and observations. And Darwin traveled throughout various continents for about 5 years. South America and the Pacific Islands, including the Galapagos Archipelago, piqued Darwin's attention. And for most of the time, the Beagle surveyed the coast of South America, leaving Darwin free to explore the continent and islands, including the Galapagos as mentioned. And thus, he collected thousands of specimens which he created and sent home for further study. And when he was on a visit on the Galapagos Island in 1835, it helped him to formulate his ideas on natural selection. And the Beagle took him not only in South America and Pacific Island but also to Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and many of the Atlantic and Pacific islands in between. And after returning back in England in 1836, Darwin started recording his research in the Journal of Researches, which was his first published book and later included in the Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle. And by the time he returned, he was an established naturalist and a well-known personality in London. And of course, his experiences and observations throughout that expedition helped him develop the theory of evolution through natural selection.
Now, let's discuss the theory of evolution or Darwinism that everyone is talking about. In this theory, there is a process called natural selection, where those that successfully adapted or evolved to meet the changing requirements of their natural habitat thrived and reproduced, while those species that failed to evolve and reproduce died off. The fossils that Charles Darwin brought from his journey gave him one of the first clues about revolution. Example, observing the remains of a Megalodon, a giant similar to sloth. He thought that those similarities were probably not a coincidence. To better understand the theory, let's have another example. A giraffe. There are features that differ within the population of the same animals. So the features that varies between our giraffes is neck length. Some giraffes were born with long necks and some were born with short necks. In this theory, the long-necked giraffe did not acquire its neck by stretching to grab the leaves. Instead, individuals within the population were born with a neck length that was longer than others. So, they have an advantage compared to the short one. To conclude this example, giraffes with long necks are in a better health advantage and were able to pass these features to their offsprings because this trait is more successful than shorter necks. Through Charles Darwin's observations and studies of birds, plants, and fossils, he noticed similarities among species all over the globe. So the species that can only be found on the mainland are quite similar to the species that he found on the islands that he visited. That leads him to believe that the species we saw on our surrounding today had gradually evolved from common ancestors, and even as humans. Darwin says that all the species, including humans, were not created independently but they descended from a common ancestor. Years had passed and Darwin wrote hundreds of pages, but why didn't he publish any? And that's because he wanted to have a refutable evidence, perhaps because he knew that his theory was going to cause quite a stir. An admirer and a fellow naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace gave him a letter that said he also reached the same conclusion as him, that evolution was produced by a natural selection. He doubted and thought that maybe Alfred Wallace would take a sole credit for his theory, so he's quite panicky and nervous about that. But later on, both naturalists agreed to present joint letter explaining their findings.
On November 24, 1859, Charles Darwin published a detailed explanation of his theory in his best-known work called On the Origin of the Species. Keynotes from the book state that the diversity of animals originated from one or a few common ancestors, and that natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution takes place in. Charles Darwin also put humans on the same evolutionary level as all other animals. His findings provided powerful insight to the Victorian Britain society, but Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection challenged the views of the Anglican Church and society as well and was considered a threat. His theories is in direct conflict with the deeply held beliefs of the Anglican Church on how life came about on Earth. By putting humans on the same evolutionary level as other animals, it contradicted the belief that humankind was given supremacy over all other living beings. In the next century, DNA studies provided scientific evidence for Darwin's theory of evolution. However, controversy surrounding its conflict with creationism, which is the religious view that all of nature was born of God, and still found among some people today.
The Copernican revolution's discoveries in physical science had brought to a split personality state of affairs in humanity's idea of the world, which remained well into the middle of 19th century. On Earth and in the skies, natural law-based scientific explanations predominated in the realm of reanimated objects. The origin and structure of living organisms were, however, explained by supernatural explanations, which relied on the incomprehensible acts of the Creator. Darwin's intellect allowed him to overcome this conceptual insanity. By adapting for biology the idea of nature as a lawful system of matter in motion that human reason can explain without turning the supernatural forces. Darwin completed the Copernican revolution. He faced overstate. Philosophers and theologians had vehemently argued over the power of the design argument to show the Creator's involvement. Darwin's greatest achievement was demonstrating that the intricate structure and operation of living things can be explained by a natural process.